I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Stephen Hawkins to you this morning. Steve has been at the forefront of the movement to advance criminal justice reform for decades. He's worked to build coalition around ending the death penalty when he was the executive director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. He has served in numerous roles at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and as executive vice president of the NAACP. He has served as president of the Coalition for Public Safety and has a long and storied career in the civil rights and human rights movement. Last year, Steve, after an exhaustive process, was selected to head up MPP, the most influential marijuana policy reform organization in the nation. And many of you know that MPP has struggled in a number of different ways under its previous leadership. Taking on the helm of that organization was quite a challenge, I'm sure. I can't even imagine. But there is no one better in my mind to do that work than Steve Hawkins. Since the day he came on board, he has been invested in building true coalition among the grassroots activists, the advocates, the folks who are on the ground doing the work, the people who have been doing this work for such a long time, and making sure that MPP is an organization that is working with others to advance these policy reforms and to do so from a position that is rooted in the justice and equity that we all seek together through these cannabis reforms. I've had an extraordinary experience working alongside Steve on some of these issues and making plans for the ways that we can change the world together. I hope that you all will too, and I'm so pleased to introduce you to this morning, Steve Hawkins.
So hello everyone, good morning. I didn't hear you loud enough, good morning. Good morning. Well, my thanks to Betty for giving me this great honor to speak at the SSDP conference. And thanks to all of you for getting up so early this morning. I heard you all some of you had a night that ended at 4:30, so I'm truly admire your stamina. So, and I'll see if you're falling asleep on me out there. So what has brought me here today? What has brought me here? I come here today thinking about a young man who I knew years ago, Jeff Curry, who I was helping in Boston. Jeff lived in Roxbury. I was a student at the time. I mentored Jeff. I brought him to my home back in Ossining, New York. I brought him into Sing Sing prison, trying to help him find his way. And Jeff was shot to death at 16 years old on a school bus in Boston because he was part of a group that sold marijuana on the street corner. And in memory of Jeff Curry, the first young person I ever lost and knew closely and tried to save, I'm here today. My years helping people on death row, trying to save them, being with some in their last moments, witnessing executions, and realizing that was the end point and the beginning of their criminalization was the police criminalizing them around drug possession. And so typically, simple marijuana possession. And I think of my own nephews in that space. Growing up in Yonkers, New York, 20 miles or bordering New York City, I should say. And for them, growing up in Yonkers, being stopped by the police and thrown up against the wall and frisked was something that was so passé that it didn't even faze them any longer. And I would pray for their safety, thinking about whether they might get shot in the course of that. And I prayed that they would not be hardened by that experience and would not go the way of so many of their friends into the prison system. Those memories and those times bring me before you all today. And my work as a civil rights attorney and as a criminal justice reformer over the years, challenging racial disparities in our sentencing system, in what my friend Michelle Alexander calls the making of the new Jim Crow. That's what brings me here today, realizing that we still have over 650,000 people arrested on marijuana in this country each year. And most of those people, it's simple possession. Hundreds of thousands still end up doing jail time, and we know that if you do somewhere like in the neighborhood of 8 days in jail, it has collateral consequences. You lose your job and other things happen. And we realize still that we have African Americans 4 times more likely to be arrested and convicted for marijuana possession than whites, although the statistics show that blacks and whites use marijuana in the same frequency. Those things bring me here today, but also what brings me here is realizing that someone like Fate Winslow down in Louisiana, and Betty talked this morning about people who cannot be here because they're incarcerated. Fate Winslow is serving life imprisonment for selling $20 worth of marijuana. And so Fate Winslow brings me here today. And lastly, what brings me here today is my time as a human rights advocate, my work with Amnesty International, traveling down to Mexico and talking to the families of the disappeared. I remember one woman whose husband bumped the car of a federal police officer in Saltillo, and the next day he was gone for a fender bender. And why? Because the federal police were given that much authority in Mexico's effort to root out drugs. And that reflects for me on how the global effort has been so centered around interdiction and enforcement instead of around harm reduction, and understanding that that's the true path forward, and I know that that's the work that SSDP champions. That brings me here today. So that's what gets me here, but how did we all get here? What is the historical journey that has brought us to this moment? And I know many of you know some of this history, but I go back to the 1800s when there was no law against possession and sale of cannabis in the United States. Now, it's funny for me as a black man to be saying that some things were better in the United States 150 years ago, but the fact of the matter is that the country had it right back then. And we see newspaper ads from the 1870s, talking about cannabis and its medical applications. And then Mexican immigrants come in the early 1900s, and they bring with them the custom of smoking marijuana for recreational purposes. And that leisure use of marijuana caught on, like most good ideas. And so we see embraced by African American musicians in the jazz age the use of cannabis. And then things change, right, with the Prohibition era, and or I should say the end of alcohol prohibition. And in that time period, what happens is Henry Anslinger, he's the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics that became the DEA later on. He needs a new target, and he decides that marijuana is that target. And what he does is he uses racism and immigrant bashing against blacks and Muslims to advance, or not blacks and Muslims, that's today, against blacks and Mexicans to make his point and his political expediency. So he claims that marijuana, and he calls it marijuana instead of cannabis because he wants to pin this on Mexican immigrants, and he talks about it as bringing violence into our society. He uses imagery of jazz music being dangerous and causing blacks to forget their place in society. He uses all of that in his arsenal. And then a couple of years later, Reefer Madness comes out as a film and shows how using marijuana on one use by a teenager can cause psychosis and cause people to go into violent behavior, and all that informs the times of that late 1930s. And then we see things like the Boggs Act by 1952, which created 2 to 5 years in prison for simple possession. But things begin to heat up when we roll into the Nixon years. And Nixon coins the phrase, the war on drugs. And under his regime, marijuana becomes scheduled as a Class 1 or Schedule 1 drug under the Controlled Substance Act. And what's interesting is that Nixon did this, but more did it as a means to crush political dissent. And some of you have probably heard this, but John Ehrlichman, he described it as, we knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be against civil rights, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, we could then criminalize both heavily. We could disrupt their communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the television. Did we know that we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. So how we have used in this society the war on drugs for political expediency has deep roots. But what happens in the Reagan and Clinton years? Well, Reagan translates Nixon's war on drug rhetoric and lays policy down, right? And in a very short order, from 1984 to 1994, Congress passes 4 pieces of legislation that vastly expand the number of people who are in our prison systems. And so much of that gets focused on drug use. The Anti-Drug Use Act of 1988 establishes a drug kingpin statute punishable by death. And the Pablo Escobars and others that were supposed to be the target never materialized, but people growing marijuana on farms down in Alabama did become the target. And so for me, and I think for us, some of that history is important and brings us here today for the work that we do. But I cannot end that discussion without talking about Bill Clinton and what he did during this period, because Clinton expanded all of it and then put on top of it things like no chance to get federal financial aid for education if you had a drug conviction, barring you from getting federal housing, barring you from being able to get food stamps. And slowly we're undoing some of that damage that was wrought. And Clinton also made available $10 billion for the building of prisons by the states. And so we saw this incredible ramp up, right, where we went from 300,000 people in prison when Jimmy Carter was president to 2.3 million people in prison by 2008, a 500% increase in a 40-year period. And we ended up in a situation where we had more people in prison for drug possession by 2008 than we had for all crimes in 1980. So just it gives you a sense of how vast and accelerated it was. And so today we have, 100 million people who've been arrested, 1 out of 3 people in our society, and so much of it fueled by the war on drugs. Well, what do we do now that moves us away from this, right? How are we moving forward away from the damage that has been wrought over all these years? My coming to MPP has given me the opportunity to see where the country has gone on the issue, right? And we can see that In 1995, 25% of the American public supported legalization of marijuana. But just last year, the Gallup poll was showing that it was up to 66%, right? And so we have this incredible political win now to our back, with the public really leading and politicians having to be dragged along as usual. So my view, folks, and listen in, because my view is that we can get to the point over the next 3 years where we could see the end of prohibition, right? We have 5 states right now, as we speak, that are taking up ending prohibition in their jurisdiction. It's New York, it's Illinois, it's Rhode Island, it's New Jersey. New Jersey tabled, but they just recently picked up another senator. Those 5 states are in play to end the prohibition and legalize for adult use. And right behind them, you have states like Montana and North Dakota and Arizona, Ohio, Maryland. They're all gearing up next year, perhaps Florida as well, to also take up either through ballot initiatives or legislation to legalize marijuana. And then in 21, we have states like Minnesota, which I'm investing in right now with organizers and lobbyists on the ground to win that state in 2021. And we also have Wisconsin in that space, and Delaware and New Hampshire, and maybe Hawaii once the governor who's there now steps down. So I don't know about you, but I see change right around the corner, because we have the political wind, we have the momentum. I also think that as the public grapples with the opioid crisis, I'm seeing someone like former Governor Rauner here in Illinois allowing patients to switch from opioid use over to cannabis. We see discussions about how to work on stemming the opioid crisis through using medical marijuana as part of a harm reduction model. We also are seeing courageous prosecutors in this space, right? People like the Baltimore attorney, the district attorney in Baltimore, the district attorney in Philadelphia, and I think maybe Kim Foxx here in Chicago as well, all moving to stop prosecuting, as a matter of office policy, anyone for marijuana possession. That's real change that's taking place. And like I said, politicians have to catch up. So one of the challenges, I think, for us, right, is how are we going to show our voice and be active in the presidential debates to come, right? Are we going to be seen in Iowa, right, in the caucuses, with SSDP T-shirts on, right? Thank you, Betty. Working and being seen, and being loud and proud in being seen in this space. That's what we have to do. And my vision for the future is, I think, threefold, right? This is about personal freedom, the government not telling you what to do, not telling you what you can or should not do with your own body and your own mind, and you having the own freedom to plant whatever you want in the ground. This is also about social justice, right? And making sure that people aren't persecuted for their behavior. And this is also about economic opportunity. Not corporate greed, there's a difference, right? But economic opportunity. Good jobs and a place for people who were the victims of the war on drugs to have a seat at the table. That's all that can be accomplished in this space. But how will we get there is the question. And the power of the people in this room is what's going to get us there. Because here's what I know. Throughout history, each generation steps up for a challenge. I used to work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where Thurgood Marshall had done his work, where if you went into the law library, it was so cool because you could see a book which he had signed, one of the old law books. But the director when I was there was Elaine Jones, first black woman to ever graduate from UVA Law School. And Elaine would say that we run a relay race of justice, right? Where each generation runs a lap or two and hands that baton over. And then you run your relay. So we're in that space now, right? Because we can look at the other challenges that have been before us, whether it was the labor movement, where we had Haymarket and people who lost their lives and were bloodied for a minimum wage and a 40-hour work week. We had people like Cesar Chavez and other great labor leaders who forged a path forward. We had a civil rights era, right, where individuals like Rosa Parks did her part, and Dr. King and John Lewis bloodied trying to cross the Pettus Bridge, and the walk from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights. Those were all people who ran their lap. We had the women's movement, the early days of the suffragists, right? Again, thrown in jail, battered, bruised, beaten, force-fed, all to move for the right to vote. And then we had people like Gloria Steinem doing her activism on the streets, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg doing her activism in the courts in the early 70s to advance the women's movement. And we had LGBT rights with Stonewall, with ACT UP, throwing, was it real blood, Eric, or fake blood on the steps of St., what was it, in New York City, Fifth Avenue. St. Patrick's. Yeah. I don't know. Okay. To marriage equality, right? And then, of course, we had human rights with the work of Mandela, with the work of Malala. And now it's your turn, right? It's your challenge around this relay. And that's ending the war on drugs. And all of you in this room are activists for that. And I know you know that, so I'm going to ask you to stand up. Stand up, stretch out. All right. And I want you to take the hand of someone next to you. Don't be shy. Betty, you're going to come. Okay. All right. I don't need anybody. You're going to come up?
Yes, absolutely. Always try to sit next to you, Steve.
All right. This quiet. You all have been a little quiet, so I'm going to try to change that. So are you ready for this challenge that I've put before you?
Yes.
So I want you to take this pledge with me. This is an oath.
This is no.
Listen to the part you're supposed to. All right. We're going to try again. The failed war on drugs will come to an end. I will not stop. I will not cease. Until victory is won. I will fight against ignorance. I will fight against shame. I will not let any politician turn me around. I will not let any attorney general turn me around. For I know in all my heart that my cause is just, that my cause is great, that I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me, who had the courage and the strength to change this world. And that is within me. There is the courage. There is the strength to do the same. So clap once if you're fired up. Clap twice if you're ready to go. And keep clapping if you believe marijuana legalization is just around the corner. I Thank you all. God bless.